Hey all, I just finished reading Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, and this is my review. So I'm going to give you a quick recommendation, who should read it, whether you should read it, and then I'm going to go through and pull out just a few highlights from the book. And at the end, I'll give you one thing that you should really know from this book, whether you read it or not. So first off, recommendation, should you read this book? I'm going to hone in on the tagline here, the legacy of autism and the future of neurodiversity. So I was mostly interested in the latter part, the future of neurodiversity. As somebody who is not autistic, identifies as neurotypical, I wanted to get a better understanding for what life is like and what coexistence and cooperation looks like among neurodivergent, neurotypical people. That's kind of my agenda. This is not really a book for that. So if that's what you're into, I'm not sure what to recommend, but it's probably not this one. That said, another interest that I have is the history of science and how science gets done. And this is a great, great book for that. So if you're interested in the history of autism diagnosis and research, the sordid history, this is probably the best resource out there. It's super interesting. So I'll say if you're interested in understanding the historical development of how we think about autism, great resource. But if you're looking for kind of like, what can I do? How can I relate better to autistic people? This ain't it. Okay, that said, if you're still with me, I want to run through some of the highlights from the book, some interesting stuff that's in here. So one of the first things we get is an analysis of some people in history that kind of, if we'd had the diagnosis and the awareness and the vocabulary, might have been diagnosed as autistic, which I found super interesting. For example, Henry Cavendish, the science guy, did a bunch of electricity stuff. I don't really know, but I'm familiar with him from high school. And when they outline kind of his habits and the ways he interacted with people, it definitely makes a strong case for not only him, but probably a lot of people who in history were thought of as, I don't know, like idiosyncratic or shy and reclusive, or all kinds of people probably just lacked the diagnosis and the understanding that we are just now getting to today. So early on in the book, we get a story about Hans Asperger, who, this is kind of like a tragic setup to the story, where basically the read here is that he is someone who got it. He worked directly with a bunch of young people that today we would probably look at as on the spectrum, but this is early days. We didn't have language for what they were experiencing, and a lot of them just got shoved in homes and abandoned back in the day. And he clearly seems to have had methods of treatment and understanding that worked. But the tragedy part enters in the fact that the rise of the Nazi regime in the 1930s more or less inserted itself and cut off his research and cut off awareness of his research to most of the world for decades to come. A recurring theme throughout this that just breaks my heart is the state of science in general, and in particular the way that we have thought about childhood development and the role of parents. And there's a lot of just sort of misguided stuff in here. There's this talk about this experiment where kids would be brought into a room and there would be gender appropriate objects like football helmets, plastic handcuffs, and rubber knives for the boys, and cosmetics, Barbie dolls, and miniature clotheslines for the girls. And the experiment was to see who interacted with what. And basically it says that if they play with the wrong toys, this was a sign that something was wrong with the child, but this is frustrated because by and large, they found most of the kids mixed the things. So it's like this whole book in a way is just the history of an attempt to project a very limited, rigid worldview onto human behavior and being frustrated when the human behavior doesn't line up with the worldview. And that, in a nutshell, is why it's taken so long to arrive at the point where we have even any understanding of autism at all. We're still in the 60s here, I think, and it's just kind of sad. Like we're floundering clearly. We don't know what to look for. So another recurring theme, also really frustrating, is the drive in science to produce results and report results, and how this pushes inevitably less than scrupulous scientific researchers to over-report, to exaggerate, to gloss, to cherry-pick what they find in order to achieve fame or funding or status or whatever. And so the book is just rife with that. And this is how a lot of Hans Asperger's early research got kind of shoved down, was that other scientists were trying to make names for themselves to become synonymous with autism, with defining it, with diagnosing it. Rather than building on this past knowledge, there was an effort to kind of take ownership of it And that is a theme that pervades throughout the book. All kinds of cures have been found and then later proved to be ineffective because in the moment the incentive was to tout it as a cure and receive wide acclaim from all the troubled parents who wanted help for their kids. It's really sad stuff. Oh, not to mention the garbage data that you get when your method consists of asking parents questions about what they remember their kids doing and then coding it into punch cards and feeding them into a computer. This is not a reliable source of information. So the noisy data in and the spurious conclusions out is kind of the model that a lot of these researchers followed. We do get some heroes, some like good guys in the saga. And we have this one scientist who's credited with kind of rediscovering some of Asperger's work and coining the phrase autism spectrum. Let's see, what's her name? Lorna, something Lorna. Her name is something Lorna. Anyway, you can read the book if you want to know these details, I guess, or it's look upable. But the point is, she came up with the word spectrum because she didn't like the word continuum, which was in use, because in her mind it was multidimensional, multifaceted. And there's this quote where she says, all the features that characterize Asperger's syndrome can be found in varying degrees in the normal population. This, maybe I should almost take it at the primary sources, because this is the kind of insight I was hoping to get from every page of the book, but it's largely this historical account of how we got here. So as you get like 2/3 of the way through at this point, as you get closer to that, you get a little closer to people who are a bit more enlightened and free thinking about the topic. So another dominant topic and theme thread throughout the book is the official diagnosis, and there's the growth and the popularity of this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which is this reference book of mental disorders. And as you can imagine, that's really political, right? What is defined as a disorder? How is it diagnosed? Exactly what symptoms need to be present? How many of them? Which ones must be present? Which ones is complicated stuff. And a lot of this, the subtext is that putting this into a book and codifying it was a way of giving validity to psychology, which was a discipline that lacked credibility for understandable reasons, for some of the stuff I've already outlined actually just briefly in this video, where it's more about making a name and claiming something and discovery than it is about actual reproducible results. And so some of the big breakthroughs came as diagnoses and the terms of them shifted over time. And what am I trying to say about this? Oh, yeah, literally in the 4th edition of the diagnostic, the DSM manual, they use the word or instead of and this is part of like this alleged supposed explosion in cases came from just a subtle shift in the language of the diagnostic tool that was used. Of course, the other reasons for the huge explosion in diagnoses was just awareness. People became aware that it was a thing, and a decrease in stigma over time too, where, I mean, there was a time, let's say 100 years ago, where if you had autistic tendencies, the most likely result was that you would be institutionalized, and that was not a very good fate for you. But as we grew to accept this and it became more mainstream and got more attention and was put in movies and on the TV and stuff, it became an okay thing to talk about. And so that's how we see a lot of the rise in cases reported. The so-called autism epidemic. So that brings us inevitably to the very spicy topic of the theory that autism is caused by vaccinations. And I certainly don't want to weigh in too much on that on YouTube. I don't want to get flagged. There's places you can go learn about that. But I think an important point that this book really drives home again and again is like the misaligned incentives in science. And so the dude, what was his name? Andrew Wakefield, failed to disclose to the Lancet editors, which is where he published this article advancing this theory, a substantial financial agreement with lawyers planning to mount a class action suit against vaccine manufacturers. And so that's just one little example of the kind of incentives that have really dragged down progress in this one particular field and the study of this one particular range of conditions. And if you just take that and explode it out across all of science, it's a little frustrating to think about where we could be if it wasn't for those types of motives. All I'm going to say about that. From the best of our knowledge about the genetics behind autism, it looks like that it's, quote, not rooted in rare de novo mutations, but in very old genes that are shared widely in the general population. So that's an interesting point. Again, to the point of going back in history, and maybe Henry Cavendish was autistic. We'll never really know, but kind of seems like it. That strengthens the case that there have been people like this on Earth since forever, and we just didn't know how to talk about them, or we didn't have any really good ideas for how to help them fit into society, and instead we put them in institutions. Really like this quote. By autistic standards, the quote-unquote normal brain is easily distractible, is obsessively social, and suffers from a deficit of attention to detail and routine. Really like that. Yeah, I almost feel attacked. Like, yeah, that's me. That's my brain for sure. That's all the tidbits I got for you. This was a really good read of history in a way, more or less starting in the early 1900s. In Europe and then moving to America, back to England. It's the history of the study of a single suite of conditions and how the really clumsy, loping journey to get to our current state of understanding, which is clearly quite limited, has gone. So if that sounds like the kind of thing you're into, you should totally read it. But the one thing that I think you should take away from this book, whether you read it or not, is just this sense of how science progresses. And if you zoom far enough out, for sure, it's just a clearly steady aggregating process of rejecting bad ideas and solidifying the new ones. That is how it goes. But in the moment, on like a decade to decade time scale, it's way messier than that. And it's very prone to outside influences, to political occurrences that come up and bury research or burn it in a library or drive people out of their professions to flee to other countries where they can't find work in that same field, or people wanting to get political gains for being famous, for being the foremost authority on a condition, or for having financial interests in the treatment of that condition, opening hospitals, investing in pharmaceuticals. It is messy, and we can do better. And it definitely makes you think that where we're at now with anything, with autism, or really the understanding of anything about the universe, is just a blip on the map. We're just getting started, and there's a whole bunch of potential. We can go so much further with any of this. That's my review. Let me know if you find that useful. If you read the book, let me know what you thought about it. If this convinces you not to read it, my apologies to the author, but I'm sure you'll read something else awesome instead. Have a good one.